Thanks to everyone who's joined today. I'm very pleased to say that we had about 250 people registered for today's webinar, and that's very exciting, and we really appreciate your interest. I am going to be presenting myself. I'm Chris Stoneman, and I work here at EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, and I have been at EPA for over 20 years, and I've worked on a variety of air quality Clean Air Act programs relating to both criteria pollutants and air toxics. And for the past couple of years, I've been working on an initiative to find ways to help states and tribes and other governmental agencies figure out ways to incorporate energy efficiency and renewable energy into air quality plans. I'm also joined by my colleague, Robin DeYoung. Robin DeYoung is a professional who works at EPA's Office of Atmospheric Programs. She has quite an extensive background in the environmental field. She's worked for the state of Ohio and has more recently, in the past 3 or 4 years, joined EPA's state and local programs branch at EPA's Office of Atmospheric Programs. And she brings a great deal of background in air quality as well as knowledge of energy issues. So she and I will be jointly making this presentation today, and I will spend the next 30 minutes speaking, and then she will follow up with a 20 to 25-minute presentation. Okay, so our agenda today basically involves, first thing we're going to do, I will spend, as I said, the next 30 minutes covering EPA's Energy Efficiency Renewable Energy Roadmap Manual, and this is a manual that we issued the first version of in July of this year. And so I will cover that, and then Robin will cover all of the quantification tools and energy savings information that we have available, which is complementary to the manual and to help support the effort of incorporating energy efficiency and renewable energy in air quality plans. And at the conclusion of both of our presentations, we'll also include some polling questions, as Mike mentioned. And these are really provided for a couple of reasons. One is just to kind of change the format a little and spice things up. But also, we're asking for some information that we think will help us improve our presentations, but also get a sense of what the degree of interest is in the states right now on this issue and how we can better work with you guys to further it. And then at the conclusion of the two presentations, we'll have a question and answer session, and we will, of course, do our very best to answer your questions. And if we can't get to them all, you should feel free to contact us either by email or by phone following this presentation. And I should also mention that we're more than happy to follow this webinar up with more in-depth presentations and discussions with different states or different regions as the need presents itself. And then finally, there are only, I think, 3 survey questions that we've asked at the very end. If you just hang on for a couple of minutes afterwards and take a moment to answer those, that would be very helpful. So basically, our objectives today are really threefold. One is that we do want to introduce the roadmap manual, as I mentioned. And this is a document that is a couple of years in the making and represents EPA's concerted effort at trying to find the tools and the approaches that will help states figure out how to integrate and incorporate energy efficiency and renewable energy into air quality plans. So we want to introduce that and kind of get into some of the details about that document. But we also want to describe, as I said, Robin will do, some of the complementary resources that we've made available to help with the task of incorporating energy efficiency and renewable energy in plans. And foremost among those are the tools that we're making available for quantifying the benefits of energy efficiency and renewable energy. We'll get into this in great detail, but one of the most vexing questions has been on this issue, how do I know how much emissions benefit I might get, and how do I know where that benefit might occur? And so we've taken that issue on and have developed a couple of tools, desktop tools, to help air planning staff answer that question. And then secondly, we have other resources, including energy savings information that we want to let you know about, and some other related things that we'll talk about some more. And then the third objective today, again, is that we do want to hear back from you on some key questions and issues, and so we've included the polling and the survey questions. And then hopefully we can, answer your critical questions, and then if not, we can certainly do follow-up on that. So that kind of takes us to, who's going to present and what the objectives are. And this then is just more detail about what I will talk about. And I'm not going to go through it now, and because I'll just go through the presentation. But I included this so that when you have the presentation for your reference, you can have this as almost an index. But suffice it to say that I'm going to go into a fair amount of detail on the manual, its contents, the different pathways that are available, methods for quantifying the benefits of EERE, what are some of the considerations for successful incorporation of EERE in SIPs, and what are some examples of some different policies and programs and measures that might be candidates for that, and so on. And then I'll conclude with next steps. So with that, let me go ahead and jump right into things. So by way of background, not everyone on the phone may be aware that in 2004, EPA did issue guidance on the incorporation or inclusion of energy efficiency, renewable energy policies, programs, and measures in state implementation plans. And that guidance was, I think, a very earnest effort and was well received at the time. However, since then, there have not been that many instances in which states have been able to incorporate energy efficiency or renewable energy in SIPs. And there are probably different reasons that states would offer for that, and we've just suggested a few here for your consideration. One is perhaps that the perceived effort necessary to incorporate EERE in SIPs might not seem justified by the SIP credit that a state could expect. So it just is one of those things where it might be almost like a cost-benefit analysis, the amount of effort not justifying the potential benefit. Perhaps EPA's guidance wasn't as clear on some issues as it could have been, and so lacking clarity and might create uncertainty and might discourage an otherwise interested state in a particular issue. Documentation requirements might be perceived as burdensome. The behavior of energy in the grid and trying to capture what the benefits would be of the inclusion of energy efficiency or renewable energy in the energy electric system is a complex issue, so lacking some of the things that we have today, we might have asked for more documentation than was perceived or I should say, asked for documentation that may have been perceived as burdensome. And then again, not clear what emission. The final reason we offer here is that it may not have been clear what emission reductions would be achievable. Again, lacking, because back then we lacked immediately available tools to help answer that question. So that's kind of the background. And so a couple of years ago, a year and a half, 2 years ago, our assistant administrator for air and radiation, Gina McCarthy, charged her offices and her staff to find ways to encourage states to incorporate energy efficiency and renewable energy in state implementation plans. And it just turns out that this is really an auspicious time, a really ideal time for considering this issue. And there's at least 4 reasons for that, and there may well be more. One is that there is a significant growth in state investments in electric energy efficiency programs, to over $5 billion in 2011. So it's really unprecedented levels of investment that indicates that the potential is there for emission reduction benefits. 29 states and the District of Columbia have adopted renewable portfolio standards with mandatory goals, and another 7 states have adopted renewable portfolio standards with non-binding goals. So again, that's a reflection of the commitment on the part of the states to the issue of energy efficiency, renewable energy. And then thirdly, states are in a position now, because NAAQS are being revised by EPA, to find greater emission reductions to ensure public health protection. And so while energy efficiency, renewable energy is not a panacea, not a cure-all, it's not going to solve everyone's non-attainment problem. However, we think it's worth considering it as part of the mix of strategies that a state might include in a non-attainment area plan. And then fourthly, we're at a stage now where we have, probably perhaps, and maybe this is a stretch, but we are at a position now where we've got an unprecedented amount of volume and quantity and quality of information on the energy and emissions impacts of EERE. Whether it's the Energy Information Administration and its data that they make available through the Annual Energy Outlook or otherwise, or whether it's Robin DeYoung's office, information they make available through the eGrid database and other databases, or whether it's non-governmental organizations such as the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and groups such as ACEEE that make available a lot of information on the impacts of these policies and programs. So these four factors really make this, I think, an ideal time, an auspicious time to be considering the issue of, what benefits could we get from EERE and how could we capture that in our SIP. So we, again, at the staff level, we were charged with we were just told that we had to basically figure out, how we could help encourage states, give states the resources, the tools that they would need to tackle this issue. So the first thing we thought that made the most sense was to help states figure out how to navigate EPA's guidance. There were at least 4 guidance documents that are out there, published in 2004 and 2005, and arguably in 2007 as well, that really touch on this issue. And so we thought, okay, well, that's got to be a bit overwhelming. So why don't we develop a document that helps navigate those guidances and help states figure out what those guidances are saying when you look at them collectively, and how can they deal with the requirements that they would need to deal with in order to bring something into a SIP. So that's what the manual is intended to accomplish, and we'll get more into it in a moment, but that's in a nutshell what it's intended to accomplish. And then accompanying that, again, as I mentioned earlier, are complementary resources. And forgive me, foremost among those complementary resources are the draft quantification tools that we're making available, and they will be peer-reviewed and usable for SIPs. Basically, they include the power plant emissions calculator, which relies on capacity factors and the capacity factor rule of thumb to make estimates about emission reductions from energy efficiency and solar projects, as well as an hourly marginal emissions tool, which is sort of a statistical dispatch tool that is a good deal more sophisticated than the power plant emissions calculator, and really looks at hourly changes in generation and emissions and tries to use that as a starting point for making estimates of emission reductions. Robin will go into these 2 tools in a great more detail, but suffice it to say that we think these represent a breakthrough for us because they're desktop tools. They don't require advanced degrees in statistics or in energy-related fields, and so they'll be usable by folks in the states, readily usable by folks in the states. So we're really pleased about that. And then in addition to that, there's energy savings information for existing state energy efficiency policies. And then thirdly, we have online training on the electric energy sector, and that's a really nice introduction to the electric energy sector and renewable energy and energy efficiency. And it's module training, so you don't have to listen to the entire thing. You can just listen to a portion of it. It was training that was conducted over an entire day and part of a second day, so that's available as well. So that's the sort of range of things that we've made available. And so I'll now talk about the manual a fair bit. So the manual itself, again, is a roadmap to the existing EPA guidance. It's detailed and comprehensive. Intentionally, we broke it up into 12 individual documents. It's over 200 pages in length total. It has a main body, which is intended to be fairly short, 30 to 40 pages, fairly plain English, pretty straightforward, accessible. This is the kind of feedback we've received on it, and it is accompanied by 11 appendices that are a good deal more detailed and more in depth, and they range from covering what's in the EPA's existing guidance to tell me more about the electric energy system, tell me more about what an energy efficiency and renewable energy policy is, and then it goes into detail on the different pathways that I'll talk more about in a moment for bringing EERE into SIPs. And then it also talks about the methodology that we use for calculating the energy savings information. So it's a fair amount of stuff in there, excuse me, and that'll be available for you to read. And also, it covers quantification methods as well. So detailed, comprehensive, accessible, easy to read. We think it's written in straightforward terms. We try to provide explanatory charts and figures So hopefully it's going to be a useful document. The feedback we've received on the draft that we issued last year is that it is a useful document. And the one thing we're very mindful of is it's not a one-size-fits-all. It provides options. So in that sense, it's flexible. There are 4 different pathways that I'll talk more about in a moment for incorporating EERE and SIPs. So, depending on your needs and what you've got, you've got some options there. And then there are different approaches for quantifying EERE impacts, and I'll talk more about that in a moment as well. The thing that the guidance document represents is basically that, first what we talk about in the main body of the manual is that states need to learn about existing EPA EERE state implementation plan guidance. And forgive me for assuming that everyone on the phone is aware of all these acronyms, AIR acronyms, but state implementation plan is the document that states are responsible for creating when an area violates an air quality standard and gets designated non-attainment. Then the Clean Air Act requires states to develop state implementation plans that basically show how the area will come back into attainment. So we suggest that that states, just sort of revisit that guidance, and they can do it by, reading the appendix that we provide in the manual. We suggest that they acquaint themselves with the jurisdiction that they're in, that their policy, the EERE policies and programs that are out there for their state or their jurisdiction, that they acquaint themselves with those. That, what's required, what do they require, and things of that nature. Thirdly, that they acquaint themselves with the electric energy system and how it functions, and that could be accomplished, in a few different ways, but we obviously are providing some training and an appendix on that, and then they could, of course, there's lots of other sources to consult on that. And then finally, that they familiarize themselves, if they haven't already, and many states have, many air staff have in many states, but if they haven't, to acquaint themselves with the roles and responsibility of key state energy-related organizations, whether it's the state energy offices or whether it's the public utility commissions, and so on. But these are agencies that play very key roles in the management of energy, and particularly with the management of the energy efficiency and renewable energy programs that they will want to become familiar with, and ultimately get a dialogue going with those offices. And then secondly, in addition to learning some things, we also suggest that that state air staff may want to go ahead and just sort of determine the magnitude of the potential emissions benefits of the EERE policies and programs in their jurisdiction. And we think we've got tools to help with that task. And it's an important task because I think that will guide what direction you go in terms of which pathway makes the most sense for bringing those policies and programs into a SIP. So that's the initial steps. Now, I mentioned the 4 pathways. So again, the document provides options, and it provides 4 different pathways for bringing EERE into SIPs. And the first pathway that's recommended is what we call the baseline emissions projection pathway. And this is simply the idea that you could incorporate the impact of EERE policies and programs in your forecast of EGU emissions. So using a model or another approach, you would want to just estimate, what would be the impact of a policy or program that can result in reduced demand for fossil fuel generation, or the replacement of fossil fuel generation with renewable generation. What impact that would have on the emissions of the EGUs in your jurisdiction in the future. And we think that makes this option best suited for the policies and programs that are already adopted. And these would be mandatory policies and programs that are already adopted at the time that you're conducting your emissions analysis. So that's the first pathway that's laid out in the manual. The second pathway that's laid out in the manual is the control strategy pathway. And this would be, I think we're probably those of us on the phone who are familiar with state implementation plans, SIPs, are familiar with the control strategy being essentially the strategy that the state is basically testing through their modeling to see whether it will result in the area attaining the standard, the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for the non-attainment area in question. So it is definitely an option that, as part of that control strategy, that you could incorporate, some of your state's mandatory energy efficiency, renewable energy policies and programs as part of that strategy. And the suggestion that we make is that this approach would be best suited for those policies that are adopted after you have prepared your emissions forecast, but before you submit the SIP to EPA. So basically, these are the strategies that you're sort of testing out to see what impact they would have on your ability to attain. So those are two of the pathways, and the next two pathways are on the next slide. And the next one is what we call the Emerging Voluntary Measures pathway. And this basically harkens back to a policy that we issued back in 2004, where EPA was trying to find a way to help areas that wanted to bring strategies into SIPs that were either difficult to enforce or difficult to quantify. So the difficult to enforce would be the voluntary measures, and the difficult to quantify would be what we would call emerging measures that are really maybe new and are just emerging and haven't yet are just not easy to quantify. So if there are policies that would fall in this category, then they could be brought in, EERE policies or programs. They could be brought into the SIP as an emerging and or voluntary measure. And we think this is probably best suited for locally based initiatives designed to encourage citizens, businesses, or local governments to reduce energy demand or rather acquire more EERE. And so I'm imagining things like green power purchases maybe that a city makes, or perhaps a local government energy conservation plan where they retrofit all government buildings with energy efficiency technologies to thereby to reduce the energy demand that local government makes. So those are the kinds of things that I think would fall well into this pathway. And then finally, the fourth pathway that we outline in the manual is what we call the weight of evidence pathway. And weight of evidence, for those who aren't familiar with it, is simply excuse me, is simply the demonstration that an area can make. As I mentioned earlier, state implementation plans are required if you have an area that doesn't attain or violates an air quality standard, so that you then have to develop a plan to show how you will make attainment of that standard. And as part of that plan, you have to have what's called an air quality demonstration or a modeling demonstration that shows how all of your strategies are going to reduce emissions to the point where the air quality is going to come down to the level of the standard. And what we say with weight of evidence is that, well, if that modeling demonstration shows that your air quality doesn't quite come down all the way to the standard, but comes down close to it, then you can bring in a number of different factors that you think will bring the area into attainment despite that discrepancy between the modeled air quality value and the actual standard. So what we point out in the guidance, or excuse me, in the manual, is that you can, as part of that weight of evidence demonstration, you can bring to bear energy efficiency and renewable energy policies. So this is something that wasn't fully articulated in prior guidance, and so it's something that we've tried to lay out fairly clearly in this manual. And it really is best suited for almost all varieties of energy efficiency policies and programs, and it's really where the modeling is you don't have the resources. You've done the modeling for your air quality demonstration. You don't have the resources to do more modeling for the policies and programs, EERE policies and programs. So this is really best suited for EERE policies and programs where the modeling is either too resource intensive or not feasible, and or the jurisdiction is not interested in SIP credit. So that's kind of, it's sort of a catch-all pathway. It kind of captures a lot of different kinds of policies and programs, and it could be mandatory, it could be voluntary, and all of that would affect the strength of the demonstration, of course, as well. So those are the four pathways, and that's really the heart of the manual. There's a great deal of time devoted to explaining those pathways, and both in the main body and in the appendices. And what the main body of the manual does, because as we've just gone through those, you can see that it can get a little bit complex in terms of, well, which way do I go? Which pathway would I go? How do I know which pathway to go with? So what we decided to do was to develop a flow chart to help agencies navigate the pathways and consider the decisions that they need to consider for how to incorporate EERE and SIPs. And that flow chart's on page 22 of the manual. And one thing I should say up front is that if you are in a jurisdiction, for example, that had, say, 3 or 4 different policies or programs, there's nothing in the guidance or in our manual that says that you'd have to put all those policies and programs in the same pathway. You could go, you could put them in different pathways in your SIP. There's no requirement that says they have to all go down the same pathway. But some of the considerations that we suggest a state would want to think about in deciding which pathway to go down for each one of the policies and programs is, first of all, is the energy efficiency or renewable energy policy or program emerging or voluntary? And by emerging and voluntary, again, we mean emerging, is it hard to quantify? And we'll have some examples in a moment so we can see what we mean by that. Or is it voluntary? Do they want SIP credit? Do they want a federally enforceable control strategy? Does the area have EERE policies and programs on the books, or are the policies and programs yet to be adopted? Do they have their own emissions projection modeling? So there's a series of questions, and so the flow chart is intended to help navigate through those, and I concluded that it would be too complex to try to go through that flow chart in this presentation. It would take up too much time, but I did want to offer to you or show you what the issues are that we think that you need to think about as you go through those. But I did include on the next 4 slides some examples for you that hopefully will help make it a little clearer as to what we mean. So first example is, suppose there's a proposed state or local government green power purchase agreement. Where would that fall down, in terms of which pathway and how would it fall down with respect to these different questions? So the first question would be, well, is this on the books? And of course the answer is no, because it's proposed, so it's not yet been adopted. Is it emerging or voluntary? And I believe the answer there would, of course, be yes, because it is voluntary. It's not something that's required. It's a state or local government is electing to go ahead and make the green power purchase, not because it's a requirement as a result of a law or anything like that. Does the area want SIP credit? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. This example doesn't make that clear. So the suggestion is that this would probably be a good candidate for either emerging voluntary measures, because again, it is voluntary, so it's a good candidate for that pathway for that reason. And it also could be a strategy that could be included in the weight of evidence as well, because again, the weight of evidence can accommodate both mandatory and voluntary efforts. So that's one example. The next example is, suppose there's a mandatory commercial whole building energy use disclosure of sale at the time of sale or lease. So this would be basically a requirement that whenever you sold a building or leased it, that you would divulge, for some period going back, I don't know, 6 or 12 months, the energy use for that building. And so the question is this on the books? Yes. So in this example, we've assumed that it's been adopted. Is it emerging or voluntary? Well, it's not voluntary, but it is emerging in the sense that it's very difficult to tell what emissions benefit might come from something like this. So it's definitely difficult to quantify. And does the area want SIP credit? Well, we don't know. Because the example doesn't make that clear. So again, this would probably be a good example of it. Could either be emerging, voluntary, or weight of evidence. Emerging again because it's difficult to quantify. And then it could, as I mentioned, go under weight of evidence because of the broad nature of the weight of evidence in terms of what EERE can go under that. Okay, third example, we have an existing state renewable portfolio policy with a mandatory goal. So this is on the books indeed. We're assuming that it's been adopted by a state legislature and implemented by a PUC. Is it emerging or voluntary? No. No, these would be relatively easy to quantify. It certainly isn't voluntary. And does the area want traditional federal enforceability? Well, we don't know the answer to that question because it's not assumed in the example. So that means that it could either be a baseline because it's on the books, so it could be a baseline and it's mandatory, so it could be a baseline strategy, or it could be a control strategy because again it's mandatory and it's on the books, so they could be a candidate for a control strategy. And then the issue there would really be whether a state would want to go baseline or control strategy on this one The critical issue would be whether they would want federal enforceability or not. Okay, then the next example is, suppose there's a proposed increase in stringency for an existing renewable portfolio standard with a mandatory goal. And then the answer to this is, well, is this on the books? And the answer to that's, of course, no, it's proposed. It's not emerging or voluntary because we can quantify it, and it certainly is mandatory. We don't know whether they want federal enforceability. So it could be a control strategy if it's adopted before the SIP is submitted, or it could be in the weight of evidence pathway. Okay, so those are the 4 examples. And what I wanted to cover on the next slide was for the 4 pathways, the document, the manual also lays out the documentation that is required for each pathway. And I initially had this laid out in a series of PowerPoint slides, and I decided to put it into one table. And I hope it's not too overwhelming. It may be that you want to take a step back from this and look at it, after the presentation today is over, and you can certainly call me if you have any questions. But what I'll do is just quickly go through each pathway and describe for you what the expectations are in the guidance. So for the baseline pathway, the expectation is that, of course, you have to, in your emissions analysis, forecast analysis, you would need to describe what policies and programs are included. Certainly need to quantify the impacts and what the impacts would be on EGU emissions in the future. Clearly, the policy or programs got to be in place, out through the attainment period. You can't include, and this would go for, of course, any policy that you included in any part of the SIP. You can't double count. You can't include it in more than one place. And then finally, it's not federally enforceable when it's included in the baseline. Second, control strategy. Again, you have to describe it. You have to quantify the impacts. The guidance actually it takes it up a step further, I suppose, by saying that it has to be quantifiable, and that's a Clean Air Act requirement. And then also it has to be permanent, and then it has to be surplus. Again, you can't double count. And then there are some particular issues that you have to consider if you're in a cap-and-trade area. And then finally, the control strategy, though, is federally enforceable, and that's a big difference between it and the baseline. And that simply means that if the SIP gets approved by EPA, then it means that EPA has the ability to enforce the control strategy. And in this case, it would be an energy efficiency or renewable energy policy, and so EPA would have the ability to enforce that policy, should it ever come to that, against the responsible party under that policy. Okay, thirdly, the emerging voluntary measures pathway. Again, of course, it has to be described. In terms of quantifying, if it's emerging, then the area can receive provisional SIP credit up front, provided there's an adequate protocol for monitoring the program or policy to make sure it's implemented and actually achieves what was believed it would achieve up front. Has to be there, permanent. Has to be a surplus, can't double count. And then if it's voluntary, then it doesn't have to meet the enforceability criterion in the traditional sense, but if the voluntary measure does for some reason cease to be during the planning period, then the state does have to make up the emission reduction. And then finally, the weight of evidence pathway, as you can see, is yes all the way across, except it does not, it will not be federally enforceable. Okay, so again, it's a little overwhelming, but I thought it made sense to put it on one slide and lay it out for folks. And happy to take questions or today or after the presentation on it. Okay, the next slide. What I wanted to do here was just sort of let you know. Okay, I had mentioned earlier on that that 2004 guidance had very limited implementation, so I thought it would be a good idea just to give you some quick examples of what that implementation could be or was, and so I'll do it very quickly. A baseline emissions forecast, the renewable portfolio standards that were reflected, that were incorporated in the Energy Information Administration's annual energy outlook was reflected in the modeling that was performed for the 1997 ozone NAAQS. And I'll leave it at that, but just suffice it to say that that was an early example of how EERE had already begun to make its way into SIPs. Control strategy pathway, there's an example from Dallas, Texas, with energy efficiency programs and new construction. on the emerging voluntary measures pathway on slide 23, the D.C. region, the Washington, D.C. region, through the Metropolitan Washington COG, included a number of different voluntary measures in their 1- and 8-hour SIPs. Shreveport, Louisiana, included some EE measures in their Early Action Compact SIP. And then finally, the state of Connecticut included some of their energy efficiency programs in their weight of evidence demonstration in their 8-hour ozone SIP. Okay, and now shifting quickly here to emissions quantification. Again, I mentioned earlier that the guidance lays out 4 different approaches, and this is again just a quick kind of table to give you a sense of what the 4 approaches are and which ones are recommended for which pathways. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but suffice it to say that again there are options here and there's a range, and it goes everywhere from the very basic approach, which is taking eGrid non-baseload emission rates and multiplying that times whatever quantity of energy savings that you are able to achieve, and it ranges from that all the way up to energy modeling, which can be obviously expensive and is used in more limited circumstances. And what Robin will be talking about are really the 2 approaches in between, the capacity factor approach and the hourly approach. Okay, so we're getting close here towards the end of my presentation. The important elements for a successful incorporation of EERE and SIPs, there are really 3 different points that I just want to emphasize here quickly. One is that you are going to get more benefit, and this is an obvious point, but I think it's worth stating that the more aggressive the policies in your jurisdiction, the policies and programs in your jurisdiction, then the more likely they're going to be producing greater potential emissions benefit for your SIP. So, if you have a renewable portfolio standard that targets 25% versus 15%, then that will, in all likelihood get you greater emissions benefit. So that's just one point that's important to make. And that it is really, I think, critical that states work regionally to combine the impacts, because you'll find that your state may benefit from your neighboring states' RPS and perhaps vice versa. So that's an important point. Second is that there's got to be a dialogue between the energy agencies and the air agencies, and that this is a point that's emphasized in the manual a great deal. Strong working relationships and partnerships is really critical. And this helps for air folks to get comfortable with the energy efficiency, renewable energy policies, and I think you'll be impressed. I've been impressed, having been involved in this for 2 years now, at the degree of accountability and tracking that occurs of the renewable portfolio standard efforts and the energy efficiency resource standard efforts as well. There's a great deal of information that's gathered. There's always room for improvement, but there's really quite a tremendous amount of work that's done. And then also, these kind of relationships will help facilitate greater understanding, cooperation, trust, and we even in the guidance recommend, although it's not required, that there be MOUs between agencies at the state level, just to have mutual responsibilities understood, and so on. Okay, then the third point is, again, and I mentioned this earlier, but I'll reiterate it, just quantification is important, and getting a handle on where and to what degree you can expect emissions impacts from your EERE will help give you a sense of which pathway to go on and how much effort to put into this. Okay, and then just to point out a couple of things. One is that there are 3 probably different kinds of areas that are perhaps going to be interested in pursuing this issue. One are ozone advance areas, and these are areas that have signed up to get early reductions of ozone precursors, either because they would like to avoid being designated, or they would like to reduce the classification that they might get if they are designated. And there are so far 24 areas in 17 states that have signed up, so there's really a great deal of interest that's been expressed. The second is areas that have been designated non-attainment for the 2008 ozone NAAQS. And there are areas that have to prepare attainment demonstrations, and there are areas that don't have to prepare attainment demonstrations but may have to in the future. And so these areas may want to consider taking a look at EERE and the potential benefits of it. And then finally, all other areas may want to consider looking at it as a way to plan for a possible tighter ozone NAAQS or other NAAQS in the future. And so here are some examples of policies that that may be good candidates for incorporation in SIPs, and they include everything from energy efficiency resource standards, which are basically mandates for energy providers to procure certain quantities of energy efficiency, all the way up to renewable portfolio standards and so on. So there's really a range of different ideas that are out there that you could think about. And this is just one illustrative example that I thought I would provide. This is really not an approvability discussion. That would be a separate discussion that would occur between a state and an EPA region. But just suffice to say that the Connecticut Renewable Portfolio Standard requires each electric supplier distribution company to obtain at least 4% of its retail load from CHP and energy efficiency by 2010. And this is part of a larger RPS that was put in place in 1998 in the state of Connecticut. 23% of retail load has got to come from renewable energy by 2020, and then there's this 4% by 2010. And so, our estimates, just based on the use of a tool that Robin will talk about more in a couple of minutes, there's about 326 gigawatts of energy savings from this policy in 2012, and it would produce emission reductions on the order of 100 tons of NOx and 320 tons of SO2. And so, that's quantifying it. And so the question is, how would this stack up against the different documentation requirements? And just real quickly, it's a permanent policy. It's adopted by the state legislature. It's quantifiable, as I've just shown. It's on the books. It's adopted. It's mandatory. It could be made federally enforceable if it were brought into a SIP, if this particular state were interested, or any other state. And therefore, it appears to be a candidate for all pathways, except it really wouldn't be a good candidate for the emerging voluntary measures pathway because it really exceeds that pathway's criteria. Okay, well, with that, let me go ahead and just conclude with my next step slide, and then we'll move over quickly to some poll questions, and then let Robin talk. We have been working with interested state and local agencies to apply the manual to quantify EERE impacts, and we have plans underway to develop examples with Maryland, New York, and Massachusetts, and several other states have started to engage and express an interest. So we intend to move forward with that effort, and are very interested in anyone on the phone who would like to discuss with us further about quantifying their EERE, and we are going to be providing technical assistance tools and training to facilitate that process. So with that, let's go ahead, Mike, and if we could put up the first polling question. I'm afraid I've probably gone on longer here than I should have, but what we've got here are 3 polling questions, and if you all can weigh in on those, we'll give you about a minute for each, and then take a quick look at the results. Okay, great. So the first question is, which pathway do you think your area may be the most interested in? Baseline, control strategy, emerging voluntary, weight of evidence, or all the above? Okay, so we have got the poll results up, and we've got 18% yes, and we have got 18% yes, and we've got 33% no, and 49% maybe. Okay, and next polling question, please. And the next polling question is, are you currently working or considering working on incorporating your area's EERE policies in your present or future SIP? Yep. Are you currently working? Yep. Yes.
That's the one we put up first, I think.
Oh, forgive me. Okay, okay. So which pathway do you think your area may be the most interested in? Okay. Baseline, control strategy, emerging voluntary, weight of evidence, or all of the above? Okay, and the results are in, and it looks like we've got 14% baseline, 14% control strategy, 23 emerging voluntary, 8 weight of evidence, and 40% all of the above. Very interesting. Okay. And then the final question is, for environmental state agencies, have you discussed the value of incorporating EERE and air quality planning with your state energy office or public utility commission? Yes, not yet, but plan to. unsure at this stage? Okay, and it looks like we've got 12% yes, 23% not yet, but plan to, 65% unsure at this stage. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much. Let's go ahead now, and I'll turn it over to Robin DeYoung, who's going to make her presentation.
Great. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our webinar and listening to the presentation by Chris and myself on the tools and resources we've developed to help you incorporate energy efficiency and renewable energy policies and programs and air quality plans. And I will discuss today an overview of the program that I work in so you can get a sense of what we do in general, and then give you detailed information on the resources that we've developed, from emission quantification tools to energy policy and measurement resources. So I work in Washington, D.C., and I'm in the EPA State Climate and Energy Program. And many of us in the program have experience at the state and local level. For example, I worked at the Ohio EPA before coming to the EPA a few years ago, and we bring our state experience to EPA to develop specific tools and resources and case studies that help describe the action steps for adopting energy efficiency, renewable energy policies and programs, how you can measure the impacts, such as the energy impacts, emissions, the economic co-benefits like jobs or the health benefits. And then we offer peer-to-peer exchange through our webinars, such as the Energy Technical Forum and our evaluation, measurement, and verification webinars. And we also help with direct assistance. And over the last few years, we've been focused on helping air regulators include energy efficiency and renewable energy in the compliance toolbox as air regulators are looking to meet the NAAQS, meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or helping industry meet the clean air rules that are related to the power sector. We're doing the best that we can to communicate how to incorporate energy efficiency and renewable energy as you plan for those things. And so today I'll talk about the new quantification resources and analyses that we've done to help you understand the linkages between your state's energy and clean air goals. And we've done a lot of training so far, as well as outreach to encourage cross-collaboration and understanding, and which hopefully will get you to plan and action steps for moving forward collectively. For example, we worked with the Region 6 states. We went there in February to talk about the opportunities there. We had a workshop in Virginia, and a few other Region 3 states came to listen to air quality planning and the resources that you'll hear today. We've discussed this with New England states, Mid-Atlantic states, and we also have a training scheduled for North Carolina in October. So we're all over the map, getting our word out and helping as best we can. Here are the 4 emission quantification approaches that were also talked about in Chris's presentation. You can find the details of these approaches in Appendix I of the roadmap. And what this table shows you is the 4 different approaches that we include, and the available tools and the electric generating unit data that is derived from these tools, or is the input to these tools. And I will discuss the power plant emissions calculator, also known as PPEC, and the hourly marginal emissions tool today. And these methods are a range from basic to sophisticated, because what we've heard from states is that translating the energy impacts to emission impacts has been very difficult in the past, or just too expensive, because you have to hire a contractor to do energy modeling for you. And so our response to that is developing these 2 tools, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them next. So first is the draft power plant emissions calculator. And the PPEC uses the capacity factor emissions quantification approach. This is a simplified tool that locates the emission reductions using eGrid information. And the most recent information is from 2009. And so you have emission factors, power plant information, capacity factor information, that all comes from eGrid. The power plant emissions calculator estimates which power plant could potentially reduce emissions from historical or reported energy impacts. You can use this tool for energy efficiency policies or programs, or solar policies, programs, and projects. And the reason why we limit it to those types of policies and programs is because we feel that that is the most reflective to the simplified assumptions that are in the tool. But we are looking into other renewable energy technologies, for example, wind, etc., that might be able to be used in the tool through our peer review process. So that we are digging into that to find out more. We've developed a tool for state and local air agencies or possibly energy planners that are interested in the emission impacts, that anyone can use this tool. And what it will help you do is quickly estimate the magnitude of emission reductions for each power plant within an eGrid subregion, because it's a very simple calculator and you get results within seconds. And if you can understand the magnitude of where the emission reductions are happening, that means you can figure out if those emission reductions are within a county or non-attainment area of interest. This tool could also be used if you wanted to make the case for doing a new policy or program with the understanding that these are simplified assumptions. I thought it would be helpful to describe the assumptions in the tool. We use the capacity factor rule of thumb as the underlying assumption. And what this chart explains is the relationship between a capacity factor and emissions displacement. In the top, so if you look at the y-axis, that is the percent of a plant's generation that could be displaced. And then the x-axis is the capacity factor. And if a plant has a low capacity factor, let's say 0.1 or 0.2, then we assume that the power plants would most likely be displaced, or the emissions, you could displace it almost 100% within this tool. And if your capacity factor is in that, and just so you know, in case you're not familiar with the term capacity factor, basically if you have a plant that has a low capacity factor, that could be a combustion turbine or a peaking unit or something that operates only during high demand days or high demand periods. So we assume those plants would be displaced first or most. And then if you have the plants that have capacity factors closer to 1, they would be the ones that are operating most hours of the day at close to maximum capacity and don't generally change with the fluctuation to demand. We assume in this power plant emissions calculator that they would not be displaced. And so that's the simplifying assumption of the tool. Another assumption to be aware of is we assume that the energy efficiency or solar program only impacts the set of power plants that are within one eGrid subregion. So you would have to pick your eGrid subregion and the policy impacts for that region, and those are the only plants that would be affected. I've developed an example to walk through the steps so you can understand how to use it yourself. The first step is you have to identify which policy or program you're looking at and then estimate the energy savings. And so I've looked at the energy efficiency resource standards and ratepayer funded programs in New England. And below there are the estimated energy savings from 2010. You can see that Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont all have these types of programs. And as Chris mentioned before, it's good to take a look regionally at what all the states are doing when you're estimating the impacts. Then you get a full reflection of what's happening on the grid. So we have 1,238 gigawatt hours as a total of the energy savings from these policies. And you might be wondering, where did I get this information from? Well, we did an analysis that looked at existing state policies that are not explicitly reflected in the Annual Energy Outlook 2010 forecast, and basically figured out what the gigawatt hour savings were from 2010 through 2020. And you can get that information on our website, and I provided a link there. So you can do this too for your state. After you get the energy savings information, you want to figure out, well, I guess I did step 1 and 2 together. I figured out which eGrid subregion the policy and program would be implemented in, and looked at all the state policies. You might have an example where the eGrid subregion splits your state in half or in thirds, and what you would need to do in that case is figure out which utilities are affected by the policy that are implementing these programs, and match up their service territory with an eGrid subregion. We have a complete summary tab in the Power Plant Emissions Calculator for you to do that matchup, and we're also going to be working with some interns and staff here so we can provide a specific example for that situation. So that should be coming out probably in the next couple of months. And if you're very interested in it, we can always do your state first. The next, after you have that picture in your head, you need to convert gigawatt hours to megawatt hours because the tool uses megawatt hours. That's a simple conversion. And you enter the energy savings in the Power Plant Emissions Calculator. What comes up next is the plants that might reduce emissions or could reduce emissions from these policies and programs. And I've just given you a snapshot of the chart here that shows you the top 10 plants that could potentially reduce emissions, and I believe this was sorted by SO2. So you can see that Brayton Point Power Plant all the way down the line are the top plants that would reduce the most SO2 emissions. You could also sort it by annual NOx emissions or ozone season NOx emission reductions. And then you also get a total up top of the full eGrid subregion emission reductions. Not on this screen, but also available are CO2 emission reductions that are in this tool. It's right below this graph. So this is a great multi-pollutant strategy, emission reduction strategy, and so you might care about your CO2 emission reductions as well as your NOx and SO2, and you can find that in the tool. We also have a Google map. I'm going to turn back here and show you a link at right here, map of all of New England power plants. You click on that and you go to this Google map. And the Google map has all of the power plants information in this eGrid subregion, and you just click on one of them and the information that's shown here. It's all static information, so it just gives you generic information about the plant, where it's located, the name of it, the fuel it's using, etc. It does not tell you the emission reduction capability. So, but we do think that it's still very helpful to be able to locate where plants are on a map. In terms of process and outreach, we have a draft version out there. You can download it today from the EERE Roadmap Manual website. Our peer review is already underway, and we plan to release our tool by the end of the year. And we've done a lot of outreach. We are trying to get the word out and give people trainings as needed. We'll have a recorded training. This training will be recorded. And we'll also have something very specific for each tool. And we are hoping to revise the tool based on the peer review findings, as well as support and maintain it over time. If you are interested in providing us feedback during our peer review process, you can email me. I've already gotten a few great suggestions on how to make the tool more user-friendly or help with functionality. So please send me your comments by September 15th, and I can include them in our peer review comment period. The next tool is the hourly marginal emissions tool. And if you remember from one of the previous slides, this is a little bit more rigorous than the capacity factor emissions calculator tool, and it's basically right below a dispatch model or capacity expansion energy model. What this tool is used statistics to simulate dispatch, which predicts the hourly changes in generation and emissions at electric generating units resulting from energy efficiency, renewable energy policies and programs. And what state and locals can do with this tool is you can identify the hourly changes that are on the margin or the next unit that would have generated electricity, and you can compare the hourly changes with energy efficiency, renewable energy, to a baseline and see those differences. It helps you understand the emission reductions during peak demand periods. So let's say you have a high electric demand day, or there are certain days that are episodic ozone days. You can look at the tool and figure out what emission reductions are happening during those periods of time. You also can compare the emission impacts of different EERE programs. For example, maybe you're deciding, or maybe your energy counterparts at your state are deciding, do we want to build wind or solar in a certain area? Well, you could plug in the wind in this tool versus the solar, and you could see how the emission changes over time at certain periods that you care about. Or you could look at different types of programs that have different load profiles and compare the emission reductions from them too. So we think this is a very valuable tool because it can give you a lot of good analysis and information to kind of cherry pick or choose the best programs or renewable energy technologies for your area. The tool uses acid rain program reported data at the unit level, and this is data that's reported to EPA on a quarterly basis. You can find that on our Air Markets program data website. Right now the tool has 2011 in it, and it only includes units that are greater than 25 megawatts. We're exploring right now future year projection capabilities, but at the current time it only looks at historical information. So stay tuned for the next update as we develop this tool. I have another example for you for this tool. I feel like that's the easiest way to explain how it works. First, you need to select your region of analysis, and I've chosen the upper Midwest. That includes these 9 states below. And what do we have here? Okay, so we have the energy savings for the states within this region. I've again looked at the Energy Efficiency Resource Standard and ratepayer-funded programs because the data is available for you and I to use for these tools. And so I was happy that I could put this together. You can see the states that have energy efficiency policies already adopted. I looked at their 2012 savings, which total about 8,100 gigawatt hours. And again, I'm plugging our resource where you can download this information for yourself from the analysis that we did. And what you do, this is the actual picture or actual thing you'll see in the tool where you select the profile, which is reduced load by an annual megawatt hour. I plugged in the megawatt hours, translated that from gigawatt hours. You just do a very easy conversion there. And the tool will show you every hour of the year, and so right now you see 1 to 28, but it really goes down to 8760, and you can see how the changes happen throughout the year. There's also the availability, just so you know, if you have your own hourly profile data, you can enter it in here. And wind and solar is also available for this tool, so you just select what you want. But in this case, we are looking at energy efficiency policies and the impacts from that, and this is what it would look like if you were doing it yourself. Oh, the animation's a little off. So we have the chart and pieces of information that you will get from the tool. Now this tool takes a little bit more time, I would say, I don't know, 2 to 5 minutes to run, which really isn't that long. You can get yourself a cup of coffee while you're waiting. And the ozone, so this is the ozone season change in NOx in the upper Midwest. And it shows you where and what magnitude of emission reduction changes you would expect by using this tool. And it uses all the unit level data, the statistical dispatch simulator to tell you this information. And we also have the total annual emission reductions available for this upper Midwest region. You can see again that this is a great multi-pollutant emission reduction strategy where you get NOx, CO2, and SO2 emission reductions together. You can also look at monthly charts by state. I chose Wisconsin in this case. So in Wisconsin, you can see the amount of emission reductions that are happening for each pollutant in each month of the year. You can also look at the county level data, which will help you understand if it's affecting a non-attainment area or something near a non-attainment area. So we thought this would be helpful for your analysis. In terms of process and outreach, the tool is currently under development. We hope to peer review it this fall, and by early 2013, it'll be available for people to use. We're going to do a lot of outreach through webinars and training. We'll make sure our regions are up to speed on this. State air agencies and state energy regulators are our first customers, so we'll be providing specific training for you all. And we'll, again, revise the tool and support and maintain it as time goes on. Now, here's the energy savings information I've been plugging throughout the webinar here. A little bit more detail. We estimated the energy savings of existing state E policies through 2020. And this is the intention of this analysis was to help you capture this emission reductions from energy efficiency policies while you're doing your SIP baseline emission projections. These policies are already on the books. And so if you're doing emission projections, you can include the impacts of these energy efficiency policies in those projections. And I listed the policies that are a part of our analysis. In general, it reduces energy demand by about 3% in 2020, and that's nationwide. And again, that's the website where you can download our information. And if you are just looking at the roadmap, our methods and approach are also in Appendix J. So we're very well connected with the roadmap as well. And then just to wrap up here, we've developed the roadmap and the complementary tools to help you incorporate energy efficiency and renewable energy policies and programs in air quality plans. We've heard in the past that you want to understand what the magnitude of impact is, if it's to make sure this is worth your time. We know you're busy. We want to give you everything that we can so that you can make this assessment up front and make it as easy as possible for you to do this. Chris mentioned working with states and case examples. We're partnering with OHUPS to do that so that we can show successful examples with quantification and for each SIP pathway. So you can easily replicate what we've produced with other states. And there are some states, there's some states out there that are really knowledgeable in this and they're already working on it, and there are others that are really interested but don't know how to get started. And so there are a lot of things in the roadmap in the very first, the main body of the roadmap that helps you get started and figuring out exactly what you need to do as you work through all of your issues. Another thing that we've noticed is that we need to help clarify what energy efficiency and renewable energy data that is available and what is needed for air quality planning. We're getting that question a lot. We understand that the air regulators are not energy experts. We're not expecting you all to be energy experts, and so we're providing basic information to help air planners answer key questions that we've already heard from you about, like what are certain energy efficiency resource standards, what do they do, how do I know if they're enforceable, how do I know the savings are really happening, I want to confirm that the impacts are real, and so we're beefing up those answers through resources that we're developing, and to help you point you to the right area within your state. There are a lot of existing resources that are already out there that can answer these questions. And I have this little graph here to explain what types of information you could be looking for and how that can help answer your questions. And so this energy, so if you look at the chart below, the energy efficiency, renewable energy policy and program data that can come from your state energy office or your public utility commission it's twofold. You could be looking for forward-looking information like forecasts or energy efficiency savings projections or renewable energy projections, and that will help you account for the savings when you do your SIP, because you have to look at your future attainment year, so you need that forward-looking information. And then you can obviously calculate your avoided emissions with that information. Retrospectively, there's also the measurement and verification information. So this information can help you validate that energy efficiency and renewable energy are good strategies, or are good emission reduction strategies for your air quality planning. You can assess if the emission reductions did happen within your SIP. And so this is just the overview, just a very quick piece to help you understand what's out there. And over time, over the next couple months, we will be developing more resources to make this as clear as possible. So here's my information and Chris Doman's information and the website. If you would like to download the roadmap manual, you can do that there. The power plant emissions calculator is available on that website. If you wanted the energy savings data from those energy efficiency policies that I've been telling you about, go to the previous slides to download it from there. So thank you very much.
Great, Robin. This is Chris. Do you want to do the two polling questions, Robin? And then I think we'll go into Q&A. And I think we will go ahead and go till 5 after 3 Eastern time so that we can try to get as many, if not all, of the questions that we've received answered.
Okay. Let me know when the first polling question is posted. Do I need to?
Okay, we'll post them. Mike will post them. Yep. Okay, Robin, do you want to go ahead and read it? Oh, okay. I'll read it.
Okay, the first.
Go ahead.
The first polling question is, are any states interested in working with EPA on developing an example quantifying emission benefits at the state level for EERE policies and programs? And I'm not sure, can people see this poll? I don't know if I need to give the screen back to you all.
No, they can see it. They can see it, Robin. Don't worry. We've got it covered. Yep.
And we're really nice and friendly and can help you, so if you're interested, we're available.
The results will come up, Robin, if you want to read them. Okay, I'm not sure Robin can read them. So we have 25% saying yes, they would be interested in working with EPA on quantifying emissions benefits. 11% have said no, and 65% have said maybe. Okay, next polling question, please.
Should I read the polling question?
Yeah, go for it.
The second polling question is, in which areas of getting started do you need further assistance? Emissions quantification, understanding EERE policies, assessing energy impacts of the policies, or starting a dialogue with your state energy office or commission?
Okay, and the results are 32% said they need help on getting started with emissions quantification. 19% said they would like help on understanding EERE policies and programs, 37% on assessing energy impacts of EERE policies, and 12% have said starting a dialogue with your state energy office and or public utility commission. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you, Robin, very much. So what we will do now is go ahead and start with the questions, and Robin and I will be answering them. And Robin, what I'm going to do is just go from the top of the list here, and I'll refer those to you that I think you would be better prepared to answer. So the first question that we've got here, and again, we will go till 5 after 3, how is mandatory policy defined? Basically, mandatory, as we defined it in the manual, is defined as mandated by a state, statute, local ordinance, or public utility commission order. So, and it's something that where someone is required to carry out an action. So that's how we define mandatory. Next question is there any value of EERE if the state has no non-attainment areas? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. I mean, EERE has value apart from air quality, which I won't go into all of those benefits. But in terms of air quality, even if there are no non-attainment areas, areas may be interested in exploring EERE and understanding it better, particularly if they have areas that are close to the standard. And I'm thinking of the ozone standard, and maybe participating in or interested in participating in the Ozone Advanced program, which is all about trying to get early emission reductions so as to either avoid being non-attainment or to reduce the severity of the non-attainment designation. The next question is, so is weight of evidence the only pathway that doesn't support jurisdictions getting SIP credit? And part of it may have been my choice of words earlier, and I don't want to confuse with the choice of the language of SIP credit and saying that weight of evidence doesn't give SIP credit. I think if you put SIP credit in quotes, then weight of evidence does give SIP credit, in the sense that if a weight of evidence demonstration is included in an attainment demonstration in a SIP, and it is a persuasive weight of evidence demonstration that is basically persuasive at arguing that an area will attain despite a discrepancy in the modeling, then the area would get, quote, credit for that, and presumably, you know, if the region were persuaded, the EPA region were persuaded that was the case, the SIP would get approved. So hopefully that makes sense. And then the next question, Robin, I'm going to ask for you to answer, and it reads as follows. Just as the EPA allowed for RECs to be used for voluntary RE achievement for SIP credit, will the EPA now consider white tags to qualify for EE achievement in SIPs? Robin, are you there?
The question is, yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, I can, yes.
Okay, great. So the question is if renewable energy credits can be used in the SIP context?
Right. Okay. Well, the question was, just as the EPA allowed for RECs to be used for voluntary RE achievement for SIP credit, will the EPA now consider white tags to qualify for EE achievement in SIPs?
Well, Chris, okay, so it sounds like the question is related to white tags and its relationship with, you know, now that we're allowing SIP credit for RECs, are we going to allow white tags to be a part of the SIP process? And I actually would have to look into how the white tags work, and so I won't be able to give you an answer, but we can get back to the person asking the question soon. It's a really good question, but we don't have an answer for if that could be incorporated in SIPs or not yet. Okay, that sounds very reasonable, and we'll go ahead and get in touch with the questioner about that. Okay, the next question is, are there instances in which a measure can be both emerging and or voluntary? Can they overlap? And the answer to that is yes, and I was trying to think of an example of where that might be the case, and perhaps a good example would be, well, I haven't got one that immediately comes to mind, but the answer is definitely yes. There is very conceivable that one can have an ordinance at the local level that mandates a particular activity, and excuse me, that is a voluntary. Forgive me, I'm sorry. That is a voluntary measure, and that is also difficult to quantify. So the answer to that is a definite yes. Okay, then the next question is, what is meant by federal enforceability? And that simply refers to how, when a state includes a measure in its control strategy, and suppose it's a traditional measure of on a stationary source, and then that gets approved by EPA. EPA then has the authority under the SIP through the Clean Air Act to enforce that measure if the state, for example, failed to enforce it. And so that concept carries over to EERE. If a state were to bring, for example, a renewable portfolio standard into the SIP as a control strategy, and that renewable portfolio standard requires that energy providers meet certain targeted levels of
renewable energy procurement each year, and if they fail to do that, then they are the implementing party, and so EPA could theoretically, if it were a control strategy, could theoretically enforce the SIP against that implementing party. That would be in a situation where presumably the state failed to do it, or some other options were exhausted. But that's what's meant by federal enforceability. Okay, the next question is, will the investment by a state or city into a commercial building energy efficiency program through a grant or energy efficiency credit count towards SIP credit under the emerging voluntary measures pathway so long as the measure meets the checklist on page 18? Robin, can you answer that?
Well, I would say that it doesn't matter if the funding comes from a grant or any other part. If the energy efficiency program does meet the checklist and you can demonstrate how it does, then it could be a part of a SIP for emerging voluntary measure pathway.
Okay, excellent. The next question is very simple. Explain CHP, please. Can you do that for us, Robin?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. CHP is combined heat and power. And what combined heat and power does is it looks at the efficiency of a process, and you can look at the output of a process and find out what the emissions are per the amount of megawatt hours generated. And if you have a very efficient process, then your emissions per megawatt hour generated can be low compared to a process that doesn't have combined heat and power. So we do have a combined heat and power partnership program that has a great website and great resources if you want to get more detailed information. So if you Google CHP and EPA partnership, you can get a really beautiful chart and description of how combined heat and power work, because there's many different ways for it to work. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a overview, and then you can get more detailed information on our website.
Great, thanks very much. The next question I'll answer. It reads as follows. Please clarify the difference between the responses surplus and yes for a double counting category on documentation. So that's a good question, and I gave a fair amount of thought to putting together the checklist that's on slide number 21 in my presentation. And what I was trying to do was to reflect how the guidance is currently written, as there is no explicit guidance that speaks to the documentation checklist for the baseline pathway or the weight of evidence pathway, but there is more explicit guidance on the documentation required for control strategy pathway and emerging voluntary measures pathway. And so that's the primary reason why in that ensure no double counting column you see a yes, then a surplus, surplus, yes, because that's a reflection of the current guidance. I also think it's fair to say that the hurdles are slightly higher, it may be even considerably higher for the control strategy pathway versus the other pathways, and in particular for surplus for control strategy pathway, the rate of guidance currently reads, if you are in a cap and trade area, then you have to demonstrate either through modeling that despite the presence of the cap, that the emissions will go down with the introduction of EERE, or you have to retire allowances. And so it's an issue that was raised in the comments on the manual that we are currently giving thought to how to revise and update, because it's a reflection of what was in the 2004 guidance. It is not a simple, straightforward issue, and that's why it's an issue that hasn't yet. It's an issue for which there is no new guidance provided in the manual yet. So it's one we're still working on, and that's also behind that surplus word in that column on the chart. So hopefully that answers the question on the part of that questioner. Okay, so next question I'm going to ask you, Robin. When you use the term quantifiable, are you referring to forecasting estimates of savings from programs and policies on the books, or measuring and verifying savings of these programs? What role does EM and V play in the inclusion of EERE and SIPs and TIPS?
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. The word quantifiable means that the way that you've quantified the emissions from energy efficiency is using a reliable and replicable method. That's basically what quantifiable means under the Clean Air Act. And so when you are quantifying your emissions and looking into the future into the future attainment year, figure out what your emission reductions could be based on the energy information that you're given, you want to use a method that EPA has discussed as reliable or replicable. And so the 4 approaches that we talk about in the manual, we also describe which pathways can be used for those approaches. So forecasting would be used as you're doing your SIP planning and as you're putting something into your state implementation plan. You can use the evaluation, measurement, and verification information later on to verify that the savings actually did happen. And that information is most useful for the emerging and voluntary pathway because, for example, in the emerging pathway, you get a provisional SIP credit, and EPA asks you later on to check and make sure that what you thought was going to be achieved was achieved. So that would probably be where you would use EM and V the most. It also can be helpful as you're doing your SIP process. So let's say you have an energy efficiency resource standard. You think that the legislature or the Public Utility Commission order says the utility needs to save 2% per year over a certain time period, right? Well, if that program has already been in place for a while, you can go back and see if the amount of savings that they said they were going to achieve last year or the year before, if that really was achieved, to give you a sense of, well, I should probably put 100% of the energy savings into my SIP. Or maybe if they didn't fully achieve what they thought they were going to achieve, then you're only going to put 90% or 70% of the energy savings in your SIP just to give you some room for error. So there are different reasons why you can use the information.
Great. Thank you very much, Robin. Well, I see we've now run out of time, and we do have several more questions here on the list. So Robin and I will talk about how to perhaps get in touch with the folks who have outstanding questions and see if we can't answer some of the additional ones, because we're very interested in continuing this discussion with you all and hopefully generating some interest in pursuing this initiative. So I want to just pause and say thank you very much for signing on today. I think this was a real success, and I appreciate it greatly, and I apologize for any of the technical difficulties we had along the way. I know we had a couple of them, but I think all in all, logistically, it seems to have worked pretty well. So thanks very much, and we look forward to continuing this discussion.